All right, so this is our first keynote talk, and we are very excited that Christina Ciardullo is joining us. You can already see her on the screen. So she'll be giving a talk, and after that, she will also join us for the panel discussion. And Christina is a senior architect and co-founder of Space Exploration Architecture and a PhD researcher at Yale Center for Ecosystems and Architecture. So welcome, Christina, and I'll hand over to you.
Thank you so much. It's great to be with you here virtually today. I'm sorry I couldn't be there in person. I'm phoning in from not the International Space Station, but California, where it is 6 a.m. So I'm having a large cup of coffee. I hope you are enjoying your coffee break as well. So I'm happy to be here virtually with you today as a group of like-minded individuals. So I'm an architect, and I've tried to walk this line between Earth and space and between research and practice to be able to situate theoretical sciences within the practical realities of building buildings, and to be able to merge a sort of love of science and space with the requirements of sustainable development here on Earth. So I'm used to talking with practicing architects who are often incredulous as to why architects who work in a service industry should be involved in research at all, or why architects should be involved in space. Equally incredulous are usually the researchers who wonder what an architect is doing in the lab, or an aerospace engineer who asks if we're here to do the renderings. So today I'm going to be an apologetic for the architectural sciences as arguably the foundational research practice that we need that works simultaneously towards habitation for sustainable development on Earth as well as space. And architectural sciences being a field of study which incorporates multiple disciplines in applied and theoretical sciences with social sciences and humanities. Architectural sciences is also being closely related to the term design science or systems thinking. And I think it will be systems thinking that I will argue will be the only thing to lead us out of a current physiochemical and mechanical paradigm towards the more biologically based solutions, which is what we're all here interested in. Systems which involve not only the technological and the human, but incorporate beyond the human. So I want to keep that in mind today as we talk about these things, which we're going to try to keep all together at once, moving from largely what we might call single function systems as represented by our current modern architectural paradigm towards ecosystemic functions in which environments are comprised of interdependent performances, from the mechanical and physiochemical towards the bioregenerative, and to look at these ideas from the perspective of both space and Earth projects in order to see the potential for simultaneous applications. So we're all here at this Biotechnologies for Space conference because we believe the potential of bioregenerative solutions. Carl Sagan famously said of our pale blue dot, that's here, that's home, that's us, on it everyone you love, everyone you know, everyone you've ever heard of, every human being who ever was lived out their lives. On it every human being that ever was. This is the planet that our human bodies evolved in. Despite the development of machines that can alter an environment, in space, it will be a piece of architecture that will act as a surrogate for our entire planet and its resources, a building that will substitute for all the chemical and biological interactions we are born into and sustain us. This planet also is everything we've ever designed for. The source of all of our standards, our preconceptions, our design thoughts that are emergent from a mix of cultures, histories, geographies, climates, tools, all materials which came from this planetary environment. Friedrich Kiesler's co-realism manifesto described this as a continuous co-emergence of technology in conversation with and affecting our natural environment and our human environments. We have existed within this feedback loop and co-evolved with this planet. So what happens when we take our bodies and our buildings out of context? Might we come face to face with something that is more essential? Might we look at our bodies and our behaviors as completely interdependent and reliant on other living things? As we leave our own planet, we become critically aware of our dependence on it and to what extent we, our design mentality, our bodies, and our cultural tied to it. The human being cannot leave the planet alone. We must take a piece of our ecosystem with us. And when we realize that, we must also see how precious our Earth is to us here on Earth, and question how we build our buildings here and how we relate to our planet. So how can we talk about this relationship from Earth to space? We spend 87% of our time inside buildings on Earth. Buildings as open systems, which enjoy the benefits of outdoor air, water, food supply, and the benefits of connection to these extended material and power grids. But how critical is it then when we move away from Earth, when we are spending 100% of our time indoors, by definition, entirely within closed systems which sustain our human bodies, that we know what it takes to create a healthy and local, circular, sustainable system for buildings. Until now, we have stayed relatively close to, as my favorite astronomer Carl Sagan again would say, on the shores of the cosmic ocean. We are able to have some resupply from Earth, but as we go further and stay longer, we have to come into an entirely new relationship with the operations of our habitat as the body's partner in sustaining life. Not a building that not only keeps us warm and dry, but eats and breathes with us. And once we've looked at what it might mean to support the health and well-being of a human indoors, we can look back at Earth. How can we continue to support the sustainable development of human societies and simultaneously inspire this love of science through space exploration? The same moment we're contemplating new space stations and lunar and Martian settlements, the UN predicts that 68% of the world's population will be living in cities. We are all well aware that there's a crisis of achieving sustainable development for the world's growing urban, and that translates to largely indoor population. And we know that engineering buildings and using the status quo is responsible for 40% of energy use. At first glance, we may say that these represent divergent interests, divergent challenges, those who are leaving Earth behind in billionaire space races versus those who are concerned with the planet and the people on it. But rather than suggest to you that we need to have a backup disk planet, an escape route, or a new source of material for increasing material and energy appetite, we might imagine instead some shared goals. We can say any experience in creating and demonstrating an indoor environment that operates within limited means and resources at scale, one capable of being internally resilient apart from extended infrastructure, will have immense promise to return knowledge and data and provide resources and provide feedback for Earth construction that must also begin to act as if materials, energy, and resources were limited. In essence, the closed spaces that are the extreme thought experiment made manifest and tangible for space applications has enormous potential to help us better understand the degree of local circularity we can apply to our more open buildings on Earth. And what I'm going to suggest to you is that we may find that in order to move towards systems which enable human health and well-being and simultaneously provide some amount of local circularity, we have to move from single function services to ecosystemic solutions. And that's where we begin to integrate other metabolic life into the equation. And at this moment, I'm going to talk specifically about higher plants and microbes. There's more to biology than that, but I'm going to kind of close it for the moment. We have until recently been vigorously separating our buildings and our interior spaces from other living systems, both on the sides of Earth and space applications. And what we may find is that we can no longer support this kind of separation of human and non-human living systems. And on the other side of that equation, the reality is, in fact, that we might need space. There's nowhere like a closed capsule for a controlled experiment. We might need the materially closed ecological experiments of space capsules to provide critical feedback and tell us about the interdependencies between human and natural environments. We might need that knowledge and data to feed back into our open systems and our open buildings. Space is a test bed like no other. And when it comes to the complexities of interdependent life processes that we're all here interested in, space offers us a place to explore our own world in small scale. So all of you are here interested in bioregenerative. And what I want to do is challenge you to understand why that is for you at a very fundamental level. Why is there a desire to integrate other than human? And no doubt all of you have very different answers to that question, very different strongly held and researched solutions Today, you will hear about agricultural solutions and regenerating food sources, multiple variations on building materials with mycelium or other engineered living materials, structural thermal envelopes, interior furnishings, fit outs, human health, as well as you will hear more about artistic and aesthetic reasons. And I'm going to talk to you a little bit about bioregenerative life support systems. All are very valid reasons for the investigation of plants and microbes and other non-human living systems, which we all believe should be a part of our life on this planet and off of it. But I want to challenge you to think in earnest about why. We are in both Earth and space operating in a very risk-averse mechanical paradigm. We have, over the course of several centuries, actively designed other life out of our built environments and created a very sterile and very fail-safe place for human beings to live. Even though architects the world over might be embracing the symbol of life, might be putting trees and plants in and on buildings, and students and designers of space habitats too will posit the green garden at the center of every space station, this isn't the current accepted reality of the building industry or the aerospace industry. So even though there's just as much excitement and interest in biological systems, there are also skeptics, just as many who will embrace putting a tree in every building, in a greenhouse, in every habitat, as there are people who will simply dismiss this as greenwashing. And there is just as much danger in wholly embracing and pushing these images as in rejecting them. So I'm urging you as designers and researchers of biologically based systems to be careful as to neither introduce unfounded systems into the mix and make false promises, nor to reject systems for lack of sufficient evidence. I want to take this moment to be quite serious about this endeavor and suggest that how we move from gray to green, the essence of that movement is embedded in the multiple reasons why we would want to do it together. So to answer why, let's start with why not. Why have plants and microbes been removed from our human habitats in the modern context? If we go back to the beginning, we might say that in fact, the earliest form of habitation were actually based around our relationship to plants and animals, specifically the domestication of plants with agriculture and the domestication of animals. They were the stuff around which we built our earliest structures and resources around which civilizations emerged. We required what Manuel de Landa calls the intensification of biomass, the concentration of material and energy flows starting from the plant's conversion of solar energy through livestock, and he refers to pigs and other domestic animals as biomass storage devices. The concentration of material and energy flows starts from the plants and goes through our biomass storage devices, concentrating humans at the top of a food pyramid. So building materials themselves were never entirely in the realm of the living. We used a lot of stone and mud, though of course we made wood, made use of wood and animal skins as well. But somewhere along the line, this intensification of biomass flows to humans meant that we were shedding an interconnected ecosystem in favor of concentrating and shortening food webs with humans at the top. Instead of building around and next to and with nature, we domesticated nature, and then we concentrated people into human habitats, shifting to a distinction between urban and rural, leaving wild out of the picture at the moment. Although we absolutely rely on our wild ecosystems for multiple ecosystem services. And this is not a teleology towards better or worse, but this is sort of a possible understanding of why we might have moved away from this sort of integration of humans and non-living humans. So why did we do that? Why did we separate them? If we, instead of experiencing a Stone Age, a Copper Age, a Bronze Age, an Iron Age, focused on living systems as a primary technological method, would we have been a little bit further along? Or I'm not seeing this as a dichotomy, perhaps our biological solutions, such as agricultural genetic manipulation in simple forms, like breeding for better crops, were simply slower due to the timeline of evolutionary and generational changes. In some senses, we did progress with biotechnologies, but compared to the immediacy and the solid and permanent properties of metals and minerals as tools, biological services are more risky due in part to the inherent complexity of biological systems. Famines, plagues, pandemics, weather. There are too many variables in biological systems for us to handle in our modern scientific method. Too many opportunities for failure, too much uncertainty. Fast forward to today, the age of modernity. Following a scientific tradition of, again, testing single variables at a time, where we can control this study, we find ourselves in this mechanical and physiochemical world where we remove every last ounce of uncertainty from our urban environments and by separating the biological. Water, the foundation of life. It's a building's terror, the carrier of Legionella's disease, mold, fungus, lichen. You might think that these are positive, but these are the bane of the current building industry, causing uncomfortable levels of humidity and dampness, decay of the minerals and metals that we use to ensure permanence on our buildings, the harbinger of illness, black mold and other pathogens. Let's not forget we're coming out of a pandemic, which was largely spread indoors. Now, to speak of including plants or biologics in our buildings is uncontrolled, risky, a wild west of unknown, interconnected and ecosystemic behaviors, which we cannot say for certain will not fail and will not compete with us as humans for dominance and control of our environment. Modern science is based on this controlled variables. It's led us to a place where designing extremely controlled environments based in these largely single function mechanical systems to achieve indoor comfort and environmental protection. Systems for heating and cooling, systems for ventilation, materials for acoustic control, parts for filtration, parts for humidification, all parts in a series of highly independent and yet efficient in their own zone. Modern practice so in many ways, we've been designing for Earth as if we were in space already. Modern practice, especially in more risk-averse markets, can be like a design anywhere. If the goal was shelter to create comfort levels, which when the outside environment might otherwise be harsh to it, we've gone above and beyond. We build skyscrapers in the desert. We can do the same on Mars. We can keep a constant temperature for those times of the year that being outside is not conducive to operations as usual. And we have achieved it with universal mechanical methods, which are meant to serve human functional requirements and human drivers alone. In 1933, architect Le Corbusier extolled the virtues of centralized air conditioning systems, saying, "At this moment of general diffusion of international scientific techniques, I propose only one house for all countries, the house of exact breathing. The Russian house, the Parisian, the Suez, or in Buenos Aires, the luxury liner crossing the equator, will be hermetically sealed. In winter, it will be warm inside, in summer cool, which means that at all times there is clean air inside at exactly 18 degrees Celsius. The house is sealed fast." He may very well have been speaking of a space habitat, the Martian house, the International Space Station, the New York City skyscraper, all with extremely tight building envelopes. Architecture critic Rainer Banham famously depicted the state of modern architecture in America as a complex of piping, flues, ducts, wires, lights, inlets, outlets, ovens, sinks, antenna, conduit, freezers, heaters, with the home as simply an enclosure for mechanical systems. What difference is it then if we seal ourselves inside a high-rise conditioned building, a machine for living, a bubble on Earth, or a bubble on the surface of another planet? Of course, we know where this has gotten us on Earth, a situation in which buildings consume 40% of the total energy that we produce to fuel these massive mechanical solutions. But why should that mean that we turn towards nature-based solutions? Are we simply replacing one method for another? Beyond evoking an image of nature, and therefore an image of sustainability, what is it we're trying to achieve by turning our attention to biological solutions? And for all of us here, we clearly see the connection between human needs and the cycles of our planet. We here all look towards achieving some of these locally regenerative behaviors in the same way that we do here on Earth through metabolic exchange. And this is certainly a narrative that is attractive to architects on Earth as well. But we want to be skeptical. We want to proceed with caution. We don't want to jump on the bandwagon. We want to listen to the critics, not to discount the great efforts of those architects who design for life in buildings and can convince their clients to spend the money on plants. But unsubstantiated claims are dangerous to the whole enterprise and can cause more damage when it comes to moving the ball forward on actually incorporating living systems within the built environment. So let's be critical. To what extent do these buildings actually use trees and plants and their associated microbiomes to perform the various functions they claim? How many plants, how many people, how much volume of space, for what function exactly? If our goal was air quality, did we deliver it? If our goal was energy reduction, did we do that? Did we want to get back to nature? Was this somehow a part of a wish to live on a mountainside instead of in an urban apartment? Is this a continuation of domestication? What is sustainable? What are you measuring? What do you mean? We come full circle back to the why. And when you're confronted with those who wish to do business as usual and wish to address some of these same functions with standard mechanical systems or a picture of plants on the wall instead, what will your argument be? This is equivalent to what will you measure? The question more or less directly leads to the solution. So why to me means what are you measuring? What are the metrics we use to evaluate the functions, benefits, opportunities, challenges of non-human living systems in a way that we can communicate with others involved in this process in a language, in a sort of collective language for the metrics of biological systems for Earth and space. So on Earth, we largely design buildings with indoor environmental quality frameworks, including the requirements for thermal comfort, visual comfort, acoustic comfort, and air quality. These are measured independently and dealt with independently. As we've said before, acoustic paneling for acoustic problems, heat and light are completely independent. Let's look at this in comparison to environmental systems, which are responsible for providing oxygen, potable water, removing carbon dioxide, filtering particulates and microorganisms, removing VOCs, monitoring trace gases, maintaining cabin pressure, temperature, and humidity, and distributing and circulating cabin air. These are the functions of an ecosystem. And the industry already the ecosystem indicates a more integrated relationship between regenerative air, water, and energy. The industry on Earth already recognizes that these functions can no longer be considered as independent, but that they are interrelated. And if we use the space capsule as an example, we expend energy to regenerate air and water, and then expend energy to deal with the byproducts of living inside a machine. We deal with the acoustic noise produced by machines, the rejection of heat produced by machines, and the visual comfort of, well, not looking at machines, and or the potential harshness of artificial lighting. So what will we learn, or how could we be more resilient if we measured or qualified things not as individual instances to be solved, but as holistic systems? Can we use the more or less closed circular capsules to try to shed some light on this complex interaction between multiple performance categories? So instead of going into the lab and measuring airspeed and air temperature, what if we measured it all? What is all? The International Space Station provides a current baseline for a degree of closure from physiochemical systems made up of primarily the water recovery system, the air revitalization system, and the oxygen generation systems. At some point, these started from subsystems with single operational requirements, once documented with 51 independent functions, towards more integrated systems. One report working towards the integration of these systems documented that the systems, by combining systems, it provides opportunities for process simplification and reductions in power, weight, and volume compared to the use of discrete subsystems. So if we have worked towards ecosystemic closure for physiochemical systems in space, could we do the same as the Grumman Aerospace Corporation here suggests in the 1970s to take that same kind of relationship back to Earth? It indeed looks quite circular from a physiochemical perspective, so why would we need plants and microbes? What was it that drew spacefaring nations around the world to look towards plants? Was it the need to address the long-term regeneration of oxygen, or the need to address the conditional consumable of food, perhaps because of the enormous energy costs of physiochemical methods, or for other intangible whys? It may be said that the biomechanical hybrid systems we see emerging on Earth for the production of various what we could call ecosystem services inside buildings have really had their roots in space, although we are currently repeating Joseph Priestley's famous experiments of 1771, where we're keeping a rat alive with a plant. We are now keeping more rats alive with more plants in the Melissa system, which I will talk about more later. The first biomechanical systems in the 1950s investigated algae for the production of oxygen, which requires less energy than electrolysis, which is the current physiochemical method to split water into oxygen. Investigations into food production in space led directly to the development of LED lighting and the birth of controlled indoor urban agriculture, and there were many other there are many others interested in investigating agriculture. In the 60s, Russians enclosed a crew of 3 in 126 square meters of an agricultural laboratory. In addition to calculating the harvest and the yields for the crops and the calorie quantities for the crew, scientists had to consider the light levels, which determine the photosynthetic rate, operating in conjunction with the respiration levels of the crew, which were a function of their mass and activity levels. So already we're noticing that we have to be measuring more variables. Perhaps most notably, we've seen a large impact from the space industry in the area of indoor air bioremediation for the control of indoor air quality. Investigations into the use of plant-based systems towards the removal of VOCs evolved from the 1960s to the 2000s, with beginnings in the context of highly sealed chambers for aerospace environments in the NASA Biohome on the right. This research has arguably brought research in indoor air biofiltration into the public forum for the past 4 decades. Beyond a concept of potted plants, the concept involves actively moving air through the root zone of the plant, where we believe various microorganisms may be metabolizing these VOCs into more inert compounds. Microbes that we might be otherwise scrubbing in filters in other contexts, ironically, in order to achieve better indoor air quality. This active phytoremediation system has been adapted and developed for more open systems on Earth and in many centers of research, including at Yale Center for Ecosystems and Architecture, where I work with this system called AMPS. We have which is active modular phytoremediation systems, with ongoing investigations in the potential for these active plant systems to show impact at scale in indoor environments. In addition to VOCs, there are a range of other behaviors to investigate. The NASA Biohome included wastewater treatment in its investigations, for example, that we've seen developed in such systems on the left as the Living Machine by John Todd and Mary Jack Todd, which remediates building black water. In air quality, the ability for the leaf area of plants to photosynthesize opens up investigations into the degree to which they may participate in CO2 mass balance in indoor spaces. Those species, circadian rhythm, and microbial respiration, among other factors such as water availability and light intensity, also participate in the determination of CO2 mass balance. Still others look to the potential for heating and cooling, from the increased humidity from evapotranspiration, or to the impacts on acoustic performance. In terms of visual comfort, human comfort levels are often contrasted with the functional mechanisms of the plant, particularly the lighting levels required for photosynthesis and therefore oxygen generation. But if we were, as a first step, to move towards frameworks which combine these metrics, where we're trying to get at is this ability of non-human living systems to perform multiple functions ecosystemically. In this case, we're beginning to map the characteristics of the plant systems on one side, sort of against the multiple functional characteristics we may have on the other side. So leaf area may push and pull on both lighting intensity and CO2 reduction. Substrate type might have impacts from microbial ability to degrade pollutants and as well as impacts on airflow velocity for thermal comfort, as well as impacts on sound absorption. The plant-based systems were solely evaluated on the ability to compete with the mechanical system of ventilation. It becomes an all or nothing game. The industry may miss an opportunity to capitalize on potentially synthetic performances. So if we were saying we wanted to completely remove ventilation and only focus on plants for air quality, we may never get there. And we don't have to, because we're doing more than air quality. So if we put it another way, to define living services in the same language as mechanical single function performances, this simply might be a non-starter. We might require evaluation metrics that represent more of a trade-off framework and less of a sort of series of requirement checkboxes. So a controlled ecological life support system, or CELS concept for space, is based on that integration of biological and physiochemical processes to construct a system which produces food, potable water, and breathable atmosphere from metabolic and other wastes in a stable and reliable manner. Central feature of cells is to use green plant photosynthesis to produce food, with the resulting production of oxygen, potable water, and the removal of carbon dioxide by providing economic, psychological and mission operations benefits. In terrestrial context at Yale, we've been working with the UN on the left to define some of these multiple potential benefits in the context of urban agriculture. Increasingly enough, both started from the interest in creating local food supply, but this branched off and grabbed other multiple services around it. So this system is describing something which is both ecosystemic, where water, waste, energy, plants, and humans interact in a metabolic rhythm, but also one which is multivalent. So let's sit with that economic, psychological, and mission benefits. So how can we quantify those benefits in a way that have meaning to both Earth and space stakeholders? If we were to combine ECLS and indoor environmental quality requirements, along with other potential services, we might decide to use the United Nations Ecosystem Services Framework, enumerating productive, regulating, and cultural and supportive functions. This framework was developed as a tool to speak directly to decision makers to quantify the benefits of largely extended wild ecosystems, and has been applied extensively to urban green infrastructure. It's not so far been applied to the potential of indoor ecosystem services produced inside the buildings, but it highlights the necessity of moving towards a framework which can express multiple potential values simultaneously. What else can we feed into an ecosystem services framework? Emerging data suggests the filtration of airborne pollutants and HVAC systems has the potential to decrease indoor microbial diversity, and others point towards a co-relationship between low ambient biodiversity and health impacts such as asthma rates. So perhaps we include microbial diversity as a key metric. Many of you here, including myself, are interested in biophilia and the psychological benefits of contact with nature, and conversely, the chronic stress and other indicators of impoverished well-being in the absence of connection to the natural world. But how do you particularly measure biophilia? Well, if you look at LEED and other green rating systems, they would measure it simply by amount of green mass, but others will measure it by, well, is it, what kind of leaf is it, or how is it spatially deployed around you? There are multiple different ways you could measure that. So I just want to take a moment before we go on that this kind of enframing ecosystem services still places non-human living systems in subservient relationships to human. Ecosystem services has been significantly criticized for being entirely anthropocentric. What can the plants and the microbes do for us? It's a biomechanical as the extension of a domestication. And perhaps it drives this point home to that it is often largely calculated and expressed in economic terms, monetary value, as a way to communicate to stakeholders. How much is that worth to me? What would it mean to include metrics that reflected more of a symbiosis with biological systems, spontaneous and willful reproduction of plants? What does plant autonomy look like? What if we were concerned with the potential benefits to the plants and microbes, not just the potential benefits to us? Is there room in our spaceship for that kind of thinking? And many of you who are perhaps talking less about life support and operational metabolic exchanges, but were more interested in the material and methods properties of biomaterials might yet require a different framework where you're communicating your ideas to other stakeholders in terms of maybe life cycle analysis or Emergent, which expresses the idea of growing materials in comparison to more static materials through the energy and material intensivity of both the extraction process. And we'll have to sort of move towards a methodology and a terminology that moves from extraction and recycling into growth, decay, and decomposition. The point being that we measure the data we measure, the actual physical, biophysical metrics we take in the lab, whether it's temperature, humidity, heart rate, room volume, microbial species density. Currently, most siloed disciplines have ways of interpreting that raw data with indicators of their own that correspond to their own values of why they were looking for that in the first place. But in order to begin to propose multivalent solutions, therefore, we must begin to map these measured environmental data points to each of the frameworks that intersects. Leaf area means something different to somebody who might be measuring biomass for food, another to somebody who's interested in air quality for human health, another thing to those who are interested in biophilia, another thing to those who are looking at it to grow materials for manufacturing. And yet we can imagine that growing plants in this example has the potential for synergistic benefits to each of those areas. The argument for growing plants for manufacturing materials on its own might not stand on its own in comparison to metals, maybe. But when we take into context these with other multiple potentials, we have an entirely new value equation, one which is more difficult to ignore. There's still much to learn about how humans interact with plants and other biologicals in an ecosystemic way. We have to be very careful. We need more data, more information. We are in luck, as I mentioned, because space capsules provide us with exactly the opportunity we need to understand these biocompatible behaviors in environments by offering us that degree of closure or reduction in complexity. And there is, in fact, a lineage of this idea in the space sector. Biosphere 2, the large experiment in Arizona in the 1990s, created a completely sealed internal environment, complete with grasslands, agricultural lands, savanna, deserts, and oceans. This was, quote, the development of a new type of scientific tool, the development of a man-made closed ecological system for investigating fundamental processes and interactions of ecosystems. It was said that these tools also had the potential for creating life support systems for space. Which is, of course, what all of you here are interested in. But they're an experimental method of working with small biospheric systems to gain insight into the functionings of our biosphere for applications in our more open systems on Earth. So in the context of learning about the complexity of interactions with the indoor environment, Biosphere 2 was just as much a mechanism as a measuring tool, and a measuring tool as a habitat. And you can see here on the top is the Eden kind of above, and the mechanical basement below, which is controlling this entire Eden. And the same is true of our experiments at Yale, where we have a green wall, very beautiful on one side. On the other side, it's still a mechanical system. It's still a pump. It's still interacting with physiochemical systems because it is still a tool. If Biosphere 2 was perhaps too large and too diffuse to understand local interactions, our colleagues in Europe have been taking a different approach to the questions of local circular metabolisms. Looking at a lake ecology, the Melissa system, which I'm sure many of you know, has recreated in pipes, tubes, and pumps, a highly controlled molecular exchange between plants, animals, and microbes. This is not kind of the Eden, for the pretend Eden of the American biosphere. This highly controlled experiment makes quite visible the realization that we're still working with hybrids. This is not a biological magic. It's a mechanical Frankenstein, a stage in a process by understanding. It's a stage in a process of understanding. And we're hopeful that the lessons learned from these interdependencies can provide solutions for both space habitats and sort of provide insights to the interactions which we can use in our buildings on Earth. It's that kind of ecosystemic understanding that we're investigating at Yale. We're working with a number of university partners and designing interscalar test beds to move between these closed capsules of space and buildings, including in this installation in the Bronx, which is part of a public safety answering center, which is meant to function when there's a disaster outside. They are meant to be able to close the ventilation systems, not allow in outdoor air, and they want to be regenerating fresh air from within. Well, we're here to test that, whether that's possible. And we're coupling that, and you can see it's the integration with mechanical systems throughout the building. And while we're hoping to achieve, we're also doing this kind of experiment at room scale. And what we're hoping to achieve is a kind of this multivalent integration of multiple functions. We're moving away from the single function performances and trade-offs to interdependent functions. And we need to be able to do that to take heterogeneous data sets from plant biology, microbiology, built environment metrics, human health metrics, in order to come to some understanding of how we can evaluate those systems for air quality, influences on thermal, acoustic comfort, food production, water recycling, etc. And we believe that this kind of integration is not only was what required of us in producing a whole environment, but that we're going to need this kind of interaction in order to push biological solutions forward. I want to end with one example. In 2019, we worked with NASA Langley Research Center. Search worked with NASA Langley Research Center to establish a competition for a closed-loop greenhouse. The predominant track at NASA is to use plants almost strictly for food production to offset the needs of resupply. After some insistence, as part of the competition steering committee, we were able to acknowledge the need to discuss the rest of the environmental loop. It wasn't just food, it was water and waste, it was air, it was the quality of life for astronauts. And we've heard the stories about just how much astronauts love to be with zucchinis. The competition came down to two very different projects. Project Demeter, envisioned on the left, envisioned a ring of modular aeroponic growing racks, accounting for lighting, material, and structural mass, mission costs, energy estimates, and gas exchanges. The team was able to achieve 100% of the required food production of 4 astronauts. Perfectly hygienic, it was described how they would eliminate microbes, bacteria, and algae growth through UV treatments. Project Sirona on the right is a multifunctional greenhouse with a kitchen, lounge, bathroom, fish tanks, nursery, growing areas. The most innovative moment came when the plants were not described as single function, but as the sum of multiple values, from psychological to medicinal to energy production to waste treatment. The concept fully integrated plants in an open environment with humans to be able to be serviced and enjoyed by the crew, where a diverse microbiome aided in astronaut immune health. But Project Sirona, for all its integrated and innovative understanding of plants, did not hit the requested target metric for food production with the same volume. So Demeter took home the prize. This project was able to meet those requirements definitions. And it's still a single function mindset that reigns supreme at today. If you look at the current NASA and Canadian Space Agency Deep Space Food Challenge project, it's a very clear representative of the way that we still think about plants in space as for food only. That's the requirement. But if we had wanted to, is this biomechanical hybrid machine on the left what we were really after in the beginning? If we had wanted a return to nature, does this seem like that? Perhaps we may be doing even worse in further domesticating and subjugating these incredible creatures by bringing them into our sterile capsules and built environments. Are these solutions the direction we wanted to be going in? If not, then what? Will it be something completely new based on the magics of physics and biology without the technological trappings of our built environment? What would it look like? Sirona was still a machine. It just had different requirements. Do we feel more connected with something that we can live inside rather than an actual visible machine for plants? It comes back to the question of why. Did we imagine an Eden in space? What were our reasons? Were plant-based systems purely performative, or did we really have something else in mind? And if it's something else, then what is it? Are we ready to give up our control over other life? The truth is that all our reasons are good ones. It's incumbent upon us to each honestly and ruthlessly understand what our reasons are, whether that is sustainability or biophilia or life cycle analysis or circular economy or our own romantic ideas of nature. Certainly mine are romantic. And to be diligent in the way that we measure and communicate those reasons to both ourselves, our fellow researchers, and everyone else involved in the built environment process in space on Earth, so that we can all work together on the multiple aspects of these solutions towards a common goal. At the end of the day, I believe that it will be the ecosystemic properties of biological systems, from systems to ecosystems, precisely the ability to address so many potential reasons simultaneously that will succeed us in bringing nature back into our cities and a piece of our planet with us, if that was a reason. For me, the reason is romantic, but for you, it might be something else. In order to change the paradigm, we need a new way of bridging multiple values to create a proposition that does more than the sum of its parts. We will need all of us and all of our reasons together to move from physiochemical to bioregenerative applications for both Earth and space. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Christina. Yeah, just amazing. I'm blown away, to be honest. And I'm sure many in our audience as well. So this would be the time for some questions. I'm just going to grab the mic, and we might have online questions, but also in-person questions. Do we have any questions from the room?
I saw one online,
But
which
I might just start off. I hope you can hear me, but I'll enlarge you a bit so we can see you better. But thank you for joining us that early in the morning. So yeah, you talked about these biospheres and whether that's, you know, the way we should go. But talking about just focusing on the sort of protected biosphere, I'm wondering how are these sort of, when we enter, how are we scanned for potential competing organisms entering that biosphere? And also, how do we prevent anything leaking? So if we create our own biosphere, after some time, there might be mutations. So potentially there might be organisms that then don't exist externally anymore. How do we prevent leakage?
Well, I think I think I would turn the question back around and say, if we're really going to do biological systems and create a biosphere, and we understand that there could be evolution and problems and leakage and mutations and epidemics, then how do we sort of work within the boundaries of that, to know that those things will happen, and to reframe how we are designing solutions to sort of include that understanding? So rather than, let's say, eradicate the microbes, eradicate the bacteria, completely sterilize ourselves, would we not change the requirements to sort of understand how we live with evolving bacteria? Can we, you know, are we able to assume some kind of risk? Where do we take the risk? So maybe, you know, are there different layers to this envelope, different layers to the risk? Maybe there's areas in which we allow sort of the unknown to happen because we don't know, because that is sort of, you know, we're working with biological systems which we don't know enough about and might never know enough about, where we sort of allow for the unknown, allow for a lack of control, allow for problems, and then, you know, decide at what level we want to be living, what level of risk do we want to be living within. So I don't know if that answers the question, but there's sort of like, it was a two-parter of like, how do we deal with the sort of the unknown mutations, and also how do we deal with leakages? Because I know leakages was a significant concern in Biosphere 2 in Arizona. I think they're technical problems that we can design out of. Technical things, when we know the requirements, we can deal with. But the more significant issue is when we don't know, when we're still unknown, what kind of control are we willing to let go, and what kind of risk are we willing to take?
Yeah, so basically living life on the edge, no, in a way, but yeah, absolutely. I guess there are also concerns, you know, might we contaminate, you know, another planet and so on. So much to consider for sure. Yeah. Do we have, so we have an audience question, just a second.
Hi, Christina, this is Leila. I hope you can
hear me.
Leila.
Yeah.
Right. I want to ask on top of that question that we just answered, it's about trade-offs, and it's about seeing the different risk trade-offs between factors affecting plants and organisms and factors affecting human comfort. Where do we place ourselves as humans? Do we still see it as we are more important? And if we are going to think of the future and testing the boundaries, how far can we go, and can we experiment fully in different aspects? Would space actually enable us to experiment fully with that?
Yeah, there's also, I'm sort of picking out a couple of things from your question. One is like, do we continue to consider ourselves as the most important? Like we are, the goal is to support a human being. And if that's sort of still the top goal, what we hope is that in these space capsules, we understand that human beings can't survive alone, that we're not meant to, that we breathe with plants and other microbes and degrade our wastes, and we have this sort of cycles. If we think of everything in terms of human beings at the top of this pyramid, instead of being a sort of one part of an ecological web, how far do we get? And the question is, if that's something that space experiments would tell us, that we need the rest of it, and we can't consider ourselves as the primary and most important parts of this ecosystem. I don't know if that also answered your question. If it didn't, please, let's keep the conversation.
Thank you. I think we have time for one online question, and then we jump into the panel discussion. But I'm just thinking maybe we also give Christina a 2-minute break to grab another tea. Sorry about that. We're really challenging you. So yeah, over to you, Sadaf.
We have a question from online audience, and it is: should we design the biosphere top down or let it emerge from the bottom up? Is there an optimal balance between control and emergence?
Yeah, fascinating. Sorry, let it go. No, this is often called the difference between sort of artificial life and artificial intelligence, and artificial life being sort of the bottom up emergence, and artificial intelligence being sort of the top down, let's organize it. And it has to, the always uncomfortable answer is like both and, yes, because of course we need to understand what is happening, what sort of local behaviors are happening at an emergent level, and that's why we do the fundamental science. But we're also here in the applied sciences trying to make use of those fundamental behaviors as we understand them, and sort of give them some amount of organization so we get them to some kind of question, some kind of place that we want to go. So I think it's spot on and incredible, like the right question: what amount of emergence versus the amount of control. And as you've seen now, we've love control. We very much enjoy being able to control. I mean, and it's not just sort of a capitalist issue. It's like a health issue. It's we want to be protecting our people, our friends and family, our cities. There's a certain amount of control that we want, and how much risk we're willing to take, how much of the behaviors, the emergent behaviors, we're willing to absorb. Our planet gives us quite a buffer with our ecosystems to be able to have multiple emergent systems. So when we get to something of a more enclosed scale, we tend to go towards the hyper-controlled, and maybe it's going to be scale that allows us to sort of absorb more emergent behaviors. Anyway, we could talk about this forever.
Thank you so much, Christina. So for all of you that joined us yesterday, we had a fantastic panel session, and one of our panel speakers was Angelo Vermeulen, and we are very excited to welcome him back. Angelo is a space systems researcher, biologist, and artist, and I look really forward to your talk now. Thank you, Angelo.
All right, you can see my slides, you can hear me. Welcome everybody. I will be talking today. Nope, okay. Technical challenges. No, that's perfectly fine. So my talk today will be about applying bio-inspired engineering for post-planetary interstellar exploration. That's really the core of what I'm going to talk about. I'm going to present to you my latest research. I mean, it's been in development for quite a number of years, I must say. We've been developing a number of computer models in which we explore some of those concepts that I'm going to elaborate upon. But to start off, I'm going to introduce myself a little bit because it's kind of relevant for the rest of what I'm going to talk about. I'm actually a biologist. I have a background in developmental biology and ecology. And this comes back into my work for space exploration. It's literally applying developmental biology and ecology in space exploration. And this will become much more clear during the rest of my talk. Honestly, I didn't plan this. This came about, and I actually only discovered while I was doing my work in the field of space that actually this completely was like a copy of what I did before as a biologist. So what I did as a biologist was actually working on this organism. It's a non-biting midge larvae. And I was working on deformities of the teeth of these non-biting midge larvae, a very particular, specific, small topic. I've been watching, observing, and investigating teeth of these larvae by the thousands through a microscope for many years. And now I'm working on interstellar exploration. So I really moved from the microscope to the outer cosmos. The reason I was investigating these deformities was actually because the larvae deform when they're living in polluted environments. They're like a sensor, like a bit similar to what we just saw. They're like a bio-indicator of environmental pollution. The interesting thing of using organisms as indicators of pollution is that they are giving you an integrated view on the overall impact of pollution in an environment. If you're going to analyze, for example, a number of chemicals, you need to make a choice. You have a limited budget. You can't analyze all possible chemicals in the environment, but a biological indicator gives you that full picture. I was always interested in the arts, and actually during my career, I also was involved in arts. I also did art studies. And at a certain point, I made a switch to the arts. And very quickly, I started incorporating my biological background into my art. And basically, I'm now operating from within the Seeds Collective. I'm rarely operating as an individual artist any longer. I've co-founded the Seeds Collective, Space Ecologies, Art and Design. And we're an international group, a cross-cultural group ranging from Southeast Asia all the way to the United States. And our main interest is really in creating projects, both art projects, research projects, in which we try to investigate the paradigms that we use to shape the images we carry about the future. What kind of paradigms are underlying our visions about the future? And can we take a step back and can we question those paradigms and can we present alternative models? And we do this through artworks, through hacking, through research. So I'm here really representing basically the entire collective. And just to give you an idea about the kind of projects we're doing, this is our most recent project. It's called Engines of Eternity. I'm not going to elaborate too much in detail about this. It requires a talk in itself, but summarized, I could say this is an artwork that has been flown to space already twice. And the unique aspect of the artwork is that we're not using space as a passive exhibition environment. We're actually using the space environment to co-shape the work. We've created an artwork that travels with a biology experiment from an evolutionary biologist in Belgium. And we're using the data of what happens to the organisms in space to algorithmically evolve the artwork over and over again. So we're probably heading for another launch, a third launch by the end of the year, beginning of next year, and maybe even a fourth launch around 2025. So it's really an artwork that is co-created by organisms, humans, algorithms, and outer space. This is the kind of work that we're very interested in. I've also participated in a number of isolation missions, analog space missions. This was the longest one. It's the HI-SEAS mission. HI-SEAS was a program that was funded by NASA. The first 6 missions were funded by NASA. And it's a Mars habitat located on the flank of the Mauna Loa volcano in Hawaii for long-term experiments, isolating people, locking people up in a small confined environment, practicing life on Mars. The interest of the HI-SEAS program is mostly social and psychological. It's not so much hardware testing. It's mostly to investigate what are the effects of long-term isolation on the individual psychology of crew members and on the social dynamics of a small group working under a high workload. We were allowed to go outside, but only wearing mock-up spacesuits. And apart from that, we only had contact with the outside world through delayed email. I've been living as a crew commander in this mission for a period of 120 days. And I must say that this experience really changes my perspective on designing for a human future in deep space. It really adds to, the insights that are needed to think about this. So what I'm going to talk about is the general concept we've been developing over the past couple of years, then the model development, the actual computer models that we've been developing. So that's going to be a big chunk of the presentation. And then some socio-ecological challenges that come out of our proposal, things that we quite haven't figured out yet, but I want to throw them into the group because it might be interesting to discuss this with the group. And as a conclusion, I want to share a few insights on transdisciplinarity. First off, just to make this clear, I'm really interested and working in the field of post-planetary design. Just to define it, because there are, of course, a number of possible definitions here. For me, for our team, the way we use post-planetary design is that we're working, aiming or focusing on a future where humanity is spread out throughout different configurations in the cosmos, basically. Some people are still living on a planet, on the surface of a planet, having this spherical view of what it means to be alive in a location. But other people are living in space stations, or they're living in starships, what we are working on. So, and it's basically the combination of all those locations and all these configurations, that's humanity. So in that way, it's post-planetary. It's nothing like we didn't leave Earth. It's not like, there was some catastrophe and we had to leave Earth. It's more like we're going beyond the idea of a sphere as the sole location for human civilization. Now, when you think about interstellar space beyond our solar system, one of the characteristic challenges that really makes it quite difficult to design for it is that it's characterized by deep uncertainty. It's interesting to contrast it with the Apollo program, for example, the lunar program. There was a similar challenge. Nobody knew what was going to happen between Earth and the moon. I mean, in the 50s and 60s, we had very little, of course, there were theories, but we didn't really know. In the beginning, they didn't even know if astronauts would be able to swallow, right? Very basic things. So what they did with the Apollo program was to go towards the moon, and at a certain distance away from the Earth, go back to the Earth, and with the lessons learned, optimize the system. And then gradually got closer and closer to the moon. It was Apollo 11 that finally touched down on the moon. That's the incremental approach. For interstellar exploration, that is not a feasible option. I mean, if you would try that, it would take you millennia to get anywhere. I mean, it's just not, you go a little interstellar, you realize a few things, you go back to Earth, you fix it, you go interstellar again. That's just not going to work. So how do you design for an environment with challenges you can't fully map, you can't fully gauge? And that's where biology comes in. And so we decided to create a concept of a growing and evolving spacecraft, a spacecraft that actually, instead of pre-designing it, taking into account all the challenges that you mapped out before, you give the spacecraft its own agency. So basically the spacecraft almost becomes like a living entity. So that's the very high level description of what we're trying to do. I'm not doing this alone. Over the past couple of years, I've worked with many people on this. This is really a group project. And what you can see also in this slide is that we typically work with people from many different backgrounds. These kind of challenges need a very transdisciplinary approach. The concept we've been developing is actually based on two technologies that are currently in developing. On one hand, asteroid mining, and on the other hand, 3D manufacturing in space. There are 3D printers on board of the International Space Station. There are a number of companies that are doing this, but the idea is actually to bring the 3D printing technology outside and to print infrastructure in space. This, once we can do this, this will totally change space exploration, of course, because instead of launching space infrastructure in small components and then assembling them, we can actually build architecture in space on a much bigger scale. Asteroid mining, asteroids contain very valuable materials. There are different types of asteroids with different types of materials. And in our concept, we're assuming that there are building materials that can be used by the 3D printer to create construction in space. And so this is the summary of the idea. It's to take an asteroid, to start mining the asteroid and hollowing it out, and then using processing the resulting material, and then using that to gradually 3D print a modular architecture that first starts inside of the asteroid, but then gradually extends from the asteroid like a tail, as you can see. The ring you can see is simply a placeholder for propulsion. We're not focusing on propulsion technologies. We're really focusing on a living architecture and how that could potentially behave in such a system. With this concept, we're actually entering the domain of morphogenetic engineering or emergence engineering. I mean, it's still a little unsure which name will finally get used. And morphogenetic engineering is an example of bio-inspired engineering. And to explain this, I always use the example of termites. It's a classic example. Termites build termite mounds, as you all know. The termite mound is actually like a farm. The termites are farming fungi underground to feed the colony. There's small larvae also living underground. So it's really like an underground colony with a high metabolism. And they're living in tropical environments. So there is a challenge for the termites. They need to bring in a lot of oxygen because that colony uses a lot of oxygen. But at the same time, they want to keep out the hot air. And through evolution, they figured out how to do this. So there's a particular configuration of shafts, there's a particular orientation towards the sun, and they kind of figured out a kind of engineered solution to tackle that problem. And for example, Rupert Soar, and I know some people here in the room have been working with him. Rupert Soar is, for example, and one of the researchers who discovered a lot of these principles. Now, the thing is, and this is my point, when termites build a new termite mound, there is not a central plan. There is no blueprint, right? There is not like a master termite running around with a blueprint telling every single termite what needs to be done. And this is what's so fascinating. As a biologist, I'm extremely fascinated by this, but it's also really interesting for engineering. It's basically the combination of the properties of the termites combined with the rules through which the termites interact with each other and with the local environment. That results in the termites' behavior, and out of that comes the structure. So the termite architecture, the termite mound architecture really emerges out of those interactions. So the locus of creativity and research shifts from the actual product you want to design, whether it's a building or a system, to the agents that are building it, right? And we can translate it to robotics, of course, swarm robotics. And that's what we're conceptually also doing. The spacecraft is being built by a swarm of robots. And so the shape of the space architecture emerges out of the interaction. So really by tweaking the rules and the rules of interaction and the properties of the individual swarm elements, the resulting structure will shift. This is a pretty significant shift in thinking about engineering. I'm not saying that all engineering will become like this. We still need the traditional top-down engineering, but as an addition for complex problem solving, I think this is really a very promising and valuable approach. So what are the advantages of such an approach? Well, first of all, because it's a decentralized approach to building and to creation, there is a lower risk of bottlenecks. If you have a very centralized top-down system, if something goes wrong at the top, the whole system just stalls. That's much less of a problem with such a decentralized approach. It's also a very robust system to troubleshoot and to create, because there's redundancy. If a few robots are eliminated, well, that's not so much of a problem if the swarm is big enough. And there is no single point of failure, right? Because we have so many agents helping with the creation. It's also very adaptive. I think that's maybe even one of the strongest advantages, because these individual agents are interacting within a local context. So you have a particular, for example, a particular topology, and then the robots or the termites are interacting with the local features of that topology. and are building the structure using that topology. If you give them a different topology, they will create a similar structure that is adapted to that particular topology. So that's really a huge advantage, instead of having a singular design that needs to fit all environments, which is of course a very different approach. So I think that's where morphogenetic engineering comes in as something really interesting. Now we've pushed it a little further. So far, I've really been talking about growth, about how to grow and actually also repair architecture. Because if you have a swarm of robots that can build a structure like this, they can also repair it. They can take away and they can repair it. But we've added a component, self-replication. And the idea of self-replicating automata is an older idea. John von Neumann was basically the first theorist that actually built an entire mathematical theory around the idea of self-replicating automata. It's basically machines that can create copies of themselves, right? It was picked up by NASA at a certain point. That's quite some time ago. In 1982, there is a really interesting report, which you can download in the database of NASA. It's called Advanced Automation for Space Missions. And it was a concept for a lunar factory in which the robots that are building the factory can also replicate themselves. So you get this exponentially growing system for developing a lunar base. It remained purely theoretical and then kind of never was picked up. And basically what we are doing in our research is really picking up this idea again. And so this is how we conceptualize it. I'm still talking about the computer models that we've developed on a pretty high level. So this is really the high level model description. We basically conceived of two units. There's one manufacturing module. That's like a module that can manufacture different types of equipment. And there is a 3D manufacturing robot, like a 3D printing robot. These are the two companions that basically generate what we want. The robot can actually print architectural shells. That's just the housing for a new module. And then it's the manufacturing modules that really create particular equipment that will define the role of the new architectural unit, right? So it's quite standardized. And then by just shifting the type of equipment, you can really play with the functionality of the resulting product. Now, the interesting thing is that the manufacturing module can also create more robots, more 3D printing robots, right? And so because of that process, it really becomes a sort of exponentially growing capacity, because the system can not only produce more habitation modules for an increasing human population, for example, it can also increase its own capacity. So that's really, really key here. And then I was talking about deep uncertainty, and to be a bit more specific, one of the elements is cosmic radiation. There is background radiation in interstellar space. It seems to be quite uniform, but the long-term effects on man-machine-made architecture is still very much unknown. I mean, there are experiments, of course, that we've done on Earth here with radiation and the impact of radiation on materials and on electronics and on biology, which are usually quite high doses. This constant input of lower level radiation that is still a little bit unknown, quite unknown. And another challenge is that interstellar space is actually not vacuum. Everybody conceives of interstellar space or outer space as vacuum. It's not strictly vacuum. There are particles and there is dust in interstellar space. It's a very low density. The problem is, if you're making or conceiving of interstellar missions, you also conceive of spacecraft that travel at a very high speed. And that's the problem. Crashing into a tiny particle with a very high speed can cause a lot of damage. So that's really an issue as well. So in order to tackle that, we've included a third concept, a third and final concept in our model. I was talking about growth, right? How the system grows itself. Then I was also talking about self-replication. And now I'm talking about evolution. Because the architecture is a modular architecture with different modules with different functions all being put together. And this enables for a metamorphic architecture. The idea is that the spacecraft has an internal model of itself. It simulates itself within the environment that it's sensing that is coming up, right? And then it starts to evolve using evolutionary algorithms. It starts to evolve. This is all virtual. It starts to evolve its own shape to see if there is a configuration, a spatial architectural configuration that is better able to withstand the upcoming challenges. If it finds something like this, it will reshape itself. Because of the modularity, we assume there is a way that modules can be moved around and the configuration of the architecture can be adjusted. Of course, this is strictly theoretical. We're not building hardware here, but it's just the idea of embedding evolution within a system like this. Now, when talking about evolution, that's kind of, it's important to be very specific here. And I'm going to read this quote because it's really relevant here. Whereas natural evolution does not have a predefined goal and is essentially an open-ended adaptation process, artificial evolution is an optimization process that attempts to find solutions to predefined problems. It's very different. Therefore, while in natural evolution, the fitness of an individual is defined by its reproductive success, the number of offspring, in artificial evolution, the fitness of an individual or starship is a function that measures how well that individual solves a predefined problem. Because sometimes I get questions like, but this is not Darwinian evolution. Yeah, Darwinian evolution is one type of evolution. It's not all evolution is like that. So this is the bio-inspired engineering concepts that we've basically been incorporating into space architecture. It's growth, with that repair, replication, and evolution. Now, it's all, you can try to figure out in computer models how to create a spacecraft that can arrive at destination structurally intact, focusing on the architecture as I just did. Now, if everything that lives inside is dead at arrival, you're still not having a successful mission. So we decided to actually, in our computer model, to include a virtual ecosystem. So we could really evaluate the evolution of the spacecraft, not just from an architectural perspective, but also from an ecological perspective. And in order to do that, we basically created a virtual model of the Melissa system. I've been working with the Melissa group since 2009, so I've been involved with this research for quite some time. Originally, I actually worked with them as an artist. But I got so fascinated with the whole thing that I decided to start contributing scientifically, and that's basically what I'm doing now. The Melissa project is a European Space Agency concept for a bioregenerative ecosystem that can recycle all human waste and turn it into useful useful biomolecules for plants and algae. Conceptually, it consists of 5 compartments that are all connected. The first compartment is basically the humans. And then all waste molecules that come out of a human body, like literally everything, sweat, urine, solid waste, everything, CO2, all of that is being captured and then using 3 subsequent bioreactors with particular bacteria or particular microorganisms, those molecules are broken down and finally turned into nitrates, nutrients, and CO2 for plants and microalgae. And the plants and the microalgae provide food and oxygen for the astronauts, and that's kind of the loop idea that we see here. I mean, Christina also talked about it yesterday in her keynote. Now, what is very particular here about this concept is this is actually, I call it molecular sustainability. It's the end of sustainability. I don't think you can get any further. It's the idea that you look at every molecule as a potential resource to keep the cycle going. You really look at every molecule as something that can be broken down, get reconfigured, and being brought back into the loop. It's more of a sensitivity and almost more like a philosophical perspective, but I really think it's a useful perspective because this is something, of course, that is also useful to bring back to Earth, this kind of sensitivity and insight. So where are we? This is basically an overview, a very high-level overview of the kind of computer model that we're developing. We're using a multi-modeling approach. Multi-modeling actually means that you're combining different modeling paradigms. There are all kinds of modeling paradigms. And in our case, we're using, for example, agent-based modeling, but also discrete event simulation. And the idea of multi-modeling, and it's a relative recent development in modeling, is that instead of discussing which modeling paradigm is the best, because then people are doing agent-based modeling and they're waving the flag of agent-based modeling can explain everything. And it's much more interesting to build pipelines that actually connect all these models, because some processes in the world can be better, some processes in the world can be better explained with a particular model than others. And by connecting all these models, that's really how you build a much more solid approach. In our case, if you can see in the overview here, we start with asteroid mining. It produces resources that are driving an ecosystem that grows, and that drives the growth of a self-replicating architecture that can also evolve. I mean, that's really the short of it. I'm going to focus now on two components of what we did. The first one is the mining architecture model, and the paradigm we used for that was discrete event simulation. It was basically created together with Farshad Goldust, who's been working this for a number of years together with me. This gives you an idea of how we conceived the model. And typically for a model, of course, you need to simplify, you need to really abstract everything very much. And this is basically a kind of a factory diagram, right? You start with the asteroid, you extract something from the asteroid, it gets mined, it gets stored, it gets processed, and the processed material is used to either create a printing robot or a manufacturing robot. And then they create the components that are used to create new modules. Now, the interesting thing here is that it's not a regular factory. And I already explained this before. Yes, it has aspects of a regular factory, which is just producing new habitation modules and new modules for bioregenerative life support, but it can also create copies of itself. The entire factory can create copies of itself, and the printers can also create, can be copied as well. So that's really quite a key difference with a more traditional factory. Now, in order to keep that process going, because we're talking about, and I haven't really talked about this yet, we're talking about a generation starship. It's really a spacecraft in which generations of humans are being born, and really we're thinking long term. I mean, this could be a spacecraft that travels for 100, 200 years, for example. We're thinking in those terms. Now, to keep that system going, we developed this differential target system. I'm going to try and explain. It's a very simple control system that really keeps the dynamics of the system going. Basically, what it says is that humans try to achieve an occupancy of a habitation module of 6. So whenever it's lower, the humans can reproduce, basically. If it reaches 6, well, they'll have to wait a little bit because it's going to get overcrowded, right? Now, the interesting thing is that the factory has the assignment to keep the module occupancy to 4. So they're almost like in permanent competition with each other. As soon as the humans are satisfied, they're like, okay, we reached 6 people in each unit, we're happy, properly populated starship. The factory is like, this is overcrowding. I'm going to produce more habitation modules, more biomodules. I'm going to lower the occupancy. As soon as that happens, the population is like, oh, we can create more offspring. And in this way, super simple system, the whole simulation just keeps growing, and the spaceship really keeps growing. We had to figure a very simple system without using artificial intelligence, a very simple controller that could do that. The computer model that we developed is a bit more specific. We have a whole number of parameters that you can tweak when you start a simulation. There is the initial conditions. How are you going to start your journey? With how many modules? Will the reserves be filled up or empty? How many robots will there be? How big the population? All of that needs to be filled out before you start your simulation, right? Then there are processing parameters. How fast is the processing? Another thing you can tweak before you start the simulation. And then thirdly, the characteristics of the human population. Is it a human population that reproduces very fast or very slow? Another parameter to be set. So in all, there are 37 parameters that you need to set before you can start your virtual journey. Now, a typical investigation of when you develop a computer model is that, first of all, you run some base runs to make sure that your model doesn't do anything crazy that is completely, that doesn't make any sense. Then you do some sensitivity analysis to figure out which parameters, if you just increase or decrease them a little bit, the whole thing goes out of whack. You really need to understand your model like this. And once you get a better grasp of your model, then the real fun starts, because then you can start creating scenarios in which you create disruptions, for example. What would happen if in the middle of your journey there is an impact and a quarter of your modules is lost? And then you can program that and then see how the whole system adapts and evolves. So that's the kind of research we're doing. We haven't completed this yet. I just received yesterday a few of the latest results of the computer model. We've been developing this for quite a number of years. I mean, it's graphs. We're not visualizing anything spectacularly. It's really just math. But what you can see here is basically on the left top, you can see that the amount of asteroid material is decreasing. Lower left, you can see that the human population is growing. And on the right top, you can see how the number of habitation modules is gradually increasing to accommodate that growing population. The interesting thing is that the occupancy rate, and that was really good, stays relatively stable at a healthy 4. So there is no overcrowding, and really the system is able to contain that growing population. Once we start introducing a little bit of stochasticity, which is more closer to reality, for example, you're mining the ore of your asteroid. Not every single time you're lucky, and sometimes there's a little less interesting material in your ore. It's a little bit of a hit and miss, right? That's an element of stochasticity. There's another element that is part of the computer model, it's wear. After a number of years, the modules need to be replaced. The factory remembers and will replace the modules. But what if the wear is stochastic? Some modules already have to be replaced after 1 year, others last for 10 years. So we introduced a little bit of stochasticity like this, and then the model starts behaving a little differently. So this is a number of runs all plotted on top of each other, and you see in certain scenarios, the asteroid material is used up very quickly, in others it takes longer. So there's a little bit of oscillation in the data that is happening. And the last result is we ran the same simulation, but with a human population with a much higher reproduction rate. So the coefficient for reproduction was much higher. And what you can see, the blue dot is basically the reference. That's the first graph that I showed. And you can see, for example, the human population is much higher. And also the number of habitation modules is much higher. But the system can handle it, because if you look at the occupancy, the lower right, it's at 4. So it's a pretty robust system that we built that can handle changes. Of course, now in our next experiments, we're going to shake the system until it breaks. I mean, that's really what you do in computer simulation, but that'll be for a next talk. I'm also going to introduce you the other model that we built, which is the bioregenerative life support model. And for that, we used a different paradigm, a different modeling paradigm, which is agent-based modeling. Agent-based modeling is typically working with individual agents that you program. What is the difference between agent-based modeling and other more equation-based modeling? In other modeling, you would, for example, use one equation to describe the behavior of bacteria in a particular bioreactor. The equation would just describe everything. In agent-based modeling, or the plants in a plant plot, that would be just an equation describing the average behavior or output of those plants. In agent-based modeling, each plant becomes an individual, which is very interesting, of course, because there is always a little bit of variation between different plants. And the interest in agent-based modeling is focusing on interactions. What happens if you have all these virtual agents with slight differences and they start interacting with each other? What kind of patterns emerge, instead of, in a very reductionist way, summarizing them into one single equation? One is not necessarily better than the other. The previous model that I showed you, the factory model, there is no need to use agent-based model there. We can perfectly summarize the things in equations for the different types of modules. But for ecology, and also for social science, it's interesting to work on a more individual basis. So you can discover interactions under certain conditions. So we did the same thing. We created a model in NetLogo. That's a particular software package that's really an open source free software package designed for agent-based modeling. Recommend it. You can just download it. It's a very light download, and there is a library of examples, which is truly fascinating. So very interesting for anybody interested in biology or sociology and simulations. Recommend it. So we created a virtual Melissa. All the Melissa compartments are there, inhabited by agents. There are a few reservoirs with, supplies, and the agents are the humans, bioreactors, and plant plots. Those are the agents that we define. Now, we needed to describe the interactions in the ecosystem, and that was quite some work. It's basically a kind of real but simplified flow of all the molecules in your ecosystem. Obviously, we're not describing every single molecule. We're really focusing on the major ones, but it needs to make sense. So it's really all about trying to figure out all the pathways between all these organisms in Melissa. And for example, this gives you an overview, and this took us a lot of work to get to this equation. It's basically the equation that we use in our model to describe human metabolism. And what you see at the top is basically, you can see the higher plants, that's basically regular crops that you eat, and they consist of carbs, proteins, and lipids, right? And each molecule has a particular composition of carbon, hydrogen, oxygen. Then people are also, the astronauts are also eating microalgae, same thing, also consists of carbs, proteins, and lipids. And oxygen, of course, because that's what we breathe. And then the output are feces, urea, water, and CO2, right? Now, the challenge is, and this is called stoichiometry, is you need to make sure that every single atom here on the left side is accounted for on the right side. Because otherwise you're creating matter out of nothing or you're losing matter. And so imagine the previous slide that I showed you, the network of all the interactions. You need to describe every interaction through chemistry that is perfectly balanced, and then you can use that in your model to make sure that all the agents are interacting in a proper way with each other. There's also the agents that you need to program. You need to give the agents some properties and some rules of interaction. For example, for the bioreactor agents, we have a system where if they don't get enough nutrients, their density and their capacity to transform molecules is decreasing, and also that their efficiency decreases when there's, for example, radiation. All of this needs to be coded in the software, of course, pretty obvious. So that's the approach that we did for the agent-based model. I'm looking at the time. So I think you have a pretty good overview now of the concept that we came up with, both the high-level concept and then the specific tools, the modeling tools that we're developing to research that concept and the consequences of embracing those principles that I talked about. Now, there are a few interesting challenges that come up when we're thinking about this. The first one is related to biophilia. So far, and this has come up in this conference numerous times, so far we've been really talking about instrumentalizing biology, the Melissa system, in function of keeping humans alive, basically. But what about the other role of nature and biology in a concept like this? The problem is a little bit those small units, those small modules. And so this is one of the explorations that we did with architecture students, in which we basically fused a number of modules and then created these rotating ecosystems inside of them. If you rotate something, you create artificial gravity, and you can create these landscapes on the inside of it. So we've been exploring how to expand our concept to accommodate for this other role of biology in an environment like this. And actually, we've been creating art installations that were really taking that question further, really questioning the absence of ecology and biology in science fiction, the absence of biology and ecology in a lot of space exploration proposals, and really building these autonomous art installations around this. And it just shows that the practice of art and science here is just going back and forth. Another issue is governance. Who and how will this system be governed? I guess you all know what this means. Would you want to live in an architecture that makes decisions of its own and just decides for you what is better? And you wake up one morning and you notice that some of the modules are gone and some new ones are being placed there and you have no idea what's going on. How will that decision making go? Can we find a way in which the spacecraft architecture is negotiating, or it's called co-creating, together with the humans? So the humans also have something to say instead of being overruled by a technological self-reproducing system. And then even more so, and that's another topic that came up numerous times during this conference, is the role of the individual biological organisms. There's a photo I took last week at the Melissa pilot plant in Barcelona. And yes, we have these individual lattice plants. They will travel with us. And we can talk about human, non-human interactions and symbiotic relationships, and I'm all for it. It's just how? How would we, how do we do decision making and taking their opinion into account in the decision making of the spacecraft. It's something that, of course, I have no immediate solution for this. But these are questions that, of course, are coming up. And also, if you would relinquish control, you would be like, you know what? They need as much agency as we. They deserve to have their own freedom as much as we. Evolution might as well kick us out. Maybe at a certain point, all the plants, crops are like, you know what? We're done with the humans, and we'll kick them out. So this is really a tricky topic to reflect. I just want to open it up as a discussion point. And then the last one, so I've talked about technology and ecology, is social cohesion. This is really a challenge in these mega structures that you develop for space exploration, of course. I mean, it's not like you have these open spaces where you can meet. Once again, if you remember the architecture that I presented, a modular architecture, if communities live on one side of the mega structure and communities on the other side of the structure, how are they going to maintain crew cohesion? I mean, thinking about the history of modernist architecture already gives us some insights in the social sensitivities or social fabric that easily disintegrates. And also, while I was doing my own high seas mission, living in isolation, I already sensed how difficult it was to maintain cohesion with a group of 6 in a small habitat, let alone in this megastructure in deep space, right? So this is also something that I haven't thought about it. I mean, I have thought about it, but I didn't find any specific solution. And it might have repercussions of how to redesign the concept. So I've been talking about a lot of different things here. These are basically some of the main things I've been showing. There's astrophysics involved, systems engineering, bio-inspired architecture, emergent engineering, developmental biology as an inspiration, computer simulation, aerospace engineering, there is digital art, etc. So how does this cloud of domains, how does this all make sense? And this is kind of the mental model that I'm using. Basically, it all boils down to this. And there are other colleagues here in the room that also explicitly work and focus on these fields. It's science, art, design, and engineering. And the way I'm bringing them together is through this diagram. We can approach things through a multidisciplinary approach. We can handle things through a multidisciplinary approach, meaning that you invite different domains to look at a challenge. And then at the end of the journey, we bring together all those insights. That's, for me, a multidisciplinary perspective. That's how we define it. Not the most interesting approach. Much more interesting is interdisciplinary, where disciplines start to listen to each other, to look to each other. And that's what all the arrows mean. Domains can actually connect with each other. They can connect with each other. They can learn from each other. They can get inspired by each other. They can use methodologies that they saw in another domain, etc. So there's a conversation is happening between the different domains. What I'm really passionate about and what I really think is the best way to me to solve these complex problems is transdisciplinarity. And transdisciplinarity is an entirely different thing, of course. And quite sure many of you here in the room, they know this. For me, the way we define it is that transdisciplinarity is a new zone, a kind of new dimension you create. You enter a new zone, and basically you step into this zone, and instead of staying focused on your own expertise and your own professional background, you step into other people's domains and you start contributing there, even though you may not be an expert. It's precisely because you're not an expert and you have that different perspective that you might be able to contribute. Now, if all the individuals in that new creative zone that you create, in that culture that you create, if all individuals start doing that, you get a massively increased collective intelligence. This requires a particular way of collaboration and a particular ethic as well, and a way of respect and allowing people to add to your expertise, even though you might have thought that you were pretty good at what you were doing and maybe there's a blind spot, and accepting that. But that's really key here. And I think that kind of, and Neri Oxman also has her own diagram in which she describes the relationship between those 4 domains of science, art, design, and engineering. She talks about a metabolism, and I think that's actually pretty accurate. It is a metabolism of people working together. Now, the crucial thing is, once you're stepping into transdisciplinarity, you're not eternally locked up in that zone. You still can step out and go back to the more traditional original domains. That's really the dynamic here. when we are doing this kind of research, art, science fiction, modeling, space exploration, it all blends, but we still produce scientific papers in traditional scientific magazines, or we build an art installation in a museum. And then we step out of that and we go back to one of those original domains. And it's really that back and forth, I think, that describes the essence of transdisciplinarity and really helps us to tackle challenges like building multi-generational starships for humanity in deep space. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Angelo. So we'll be taking audience questions now. Raise your hand. Katja.
Thank you so much for giving us such a great vision for what a space habitat could be and how we can actually get there technologically. I was going to respond, there's so much to respond to, but I was going to respond to the modular architecture that you are proposing and developing. So there is the self-replicating model, and then there is a habitat model for 4 or 6 people. Just thinking, relating it to the history of modular architectures, right? Like, how do we think about, I mean, living in confinement, right? But then we need like personal spaces, and then like people coming together as a shared space, or like larger combination of units, and then what like public spaces could be. But also how this relates to the environment in space. Like, do we aggregate it horizontally, vertically? Do we go underground? Do you have those considerations in mind?
Actually, yes. And the idea of the number of 6 was actually an average. We actually imagine that there will be more than 6 people living in one module, but there will be other modules that will be fused to operate more as social spaces. And on average, we get a number 6. So that's basically the idea. A number of people in the team have been trying to come up with concepts. The only disadvantage, and it's a bit of a trade-off, is the more we start fusing those modules to create rotating ecosystems, to create artificial gravity, to create social spaces, the less flexible the entire structure becomes, of course, because then you can't really easily move around things any longer. So that's really a trade-off there. And it's definitely part of our interest, but currently we're really focusing on the two models that I've already shown. Yeah.
Hi, yeah, it was a really nice talk. I was just wondering briefly, when you were modeling the world ships, you were talking about like the 4 to 6 people per module. Did you input at all into the model like numbers for how many people it should start off with to sort of sustain the population from a sort of genetic perspective, like for generations going on, and how that would, yeah, basically how that would be sustainable? Like, because I'm assuming there was a kind of a minimum number of humans to sustain the sort of genetic diversity that you would need for that ongoing. Thanks.
So brief answer, it has not been included yet, but the modeling environment perfectly allows for it. It's just first things first. It's already as complex as it is. We're using a standard population growth model that includes a carrying capacity. So it really, and the carrying capacity here is really related to the number of modules that are available and to the occupancy, and that kind of slows down the population growth. In our experiments that I showed here, we started with about 150 people. Now, I must say that the literature on how big your population should be to avoid long-term issues of inbreeding, basically of lack of genetic diversity, there are quite different visions on it. Some people are like, oh, we can start with 50, and other ones are like, no, we need 500, for example. So there is not yet so much agreement on this. In terms of, it's not just about the genetic diversity you start with, it's also about the loss, genetic drift, where you lose some of the diversity that you started with. And then thirdly, there is also the issue of mutations, of course, where it's not because of genetic drift, which is a chance operation, but it's because of radiation, for example, that you lose diversity. I'm really interested in this idea of DNA printing and having the information on board to DNA print basically what you've lost. But that depends on, the more I've been thinking about this, the more it becomes essential that information is going to be the central key component of a project like this. If information is lost, it's all gone. That is really key. Yeah.
So I'd like to check if we've got an online question. Yeah, and then I'd say we've got time for one more question in the room.
Coming from a more common architectural background on spaceship Earth, did you think on mining not an asteroid, but Earth or existing buildings?
No, not really. The idea is basically to use the resources that are already out there in space, instead of having to move everything from the Earth into space. And then secondly, asteroids usually already have they have a velocity, they have kinetic energy, and by simply redirecting the asteroid, we can actually piggyback on the trajectory of the asteroid. So that those are all really interesting advantages. Also, as you could see in the diagrams, we're not consuming the entire asteroid. We're really only consuming a part of it. So the front part of the asteroid operates as a shield for potential particle impact. So there are multiple reasons why the idea of an asteroid is interesting. By the way, the idea of using an asteroid and transforming that into space architecture is nothing that we came up with. This is a trope in science fiction. Computer games like Mass Effect, for example, we have multiple examples of asteroids and rocks in space that have been transformed. There are books, science fiction books in which this is featured. I think what we're trying to do is to make it more real and to start turning that into actual scientific research.
I think you were one of the first. So you've got the pleasure of the last question.
Yeah, so if the humans, we have our senses are kind of encoded in our genetics, like how we perceive the environment, how we touch, how we see. Do you think that there is any building or structure nowadays that is, that is encoded in our genetics, so that if our way to engage with, like the termites, with the environment, and also within like with each other, then maybe there is some sort of emerging building or emerging structure that happened. Yeah.
Yeah, this brings me to something I've been thinking about a lot as well, is what is encoded. And it brings me to two things, and I'm definitely going to answer your question as well, but biophilia. And recently for a scientific journal, a popular science journal, I proposed an experiment to figure out what biophilia is all about. And I was like, let's grow children, babies, let's conceive and grow babies on the moon and not show them anything biological. I mean, it's a completely unacceptable experiment, I know, but let's assume. And these humans, then when they're, adult or adolescent, we bring them to Earth and we'll observe their response to nature and to the surface of the Earth. What will happen? This is a really key question. It's a key question to design our future in a post-planetary condition, because if they burst out in tears and they're totally emotional about, like, my God, I was missing this my whole life and had no clue what I was missing, well, then biophilia is definitely encoded in our genes, right? If they become nostalgic for the beautiful shades of gray on the moon and they really get bored with Earth after some time, well, then maybe we're very malleable. And then maybe we don't have to take along these visions of ecosystems into space. And that's something we will have to figure out somehow, probably not through an experiment as I just suggested, but it was a thought experiment, just to be clear. The architecture is interesting because I don't think that architecture is encoded in our genes, but I rather think that architecture emerges out of our physical dimensions and the way we interact with our opposing thumbs, interact with the world. I mean, doors have been pretty similar for a number of thousands of years. I mean, we haven't changed that, and it seems to be coming back. But that's not because it's encoded. It's more like it emerges out of our physical size and constitution and way of moving around. So that's a difference there. No.
Right, fabulous. Thank you so much, Angelo. That was really inspiring.